Onto the tutorial for a welt pocket, and firstly I've marked the position, just thread traced where I want my welt to be, and you'll notice that it is at an angle, which is pretty commonplace on certainly front of a jacket or a blazer. Of course you could do a straight welt pocket, which you quite often find in coats, and this tutorial will work for both. You just need to cut your pieces slightly differently, but I'll explain that as we go along. The two lines at the end represent where the welt's going to finish. I've also got another piece of the same fabric, and this is going to be turned into the welt. I've cut two 6-inch square pieces of pocketing, so these are going to form the actual pocket inside the welt. I've got two of those. I've also cut a smaller piece of the same pocketing material, this time being 2 inches by 6 inches wide. This is going to act as some reinforcement later on. And finally, a piece of fusible interfacing. Now normally I would use the woven variety, woven interfacing. It's a little bit more robust. However, for this tutorial I'm just using some plain white. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our fusible interfacing, and this is the back and this is the side that has the glue on, and on the back I'm going to mark 1/4 of an inch at the top here on the right hand side, and I'm going to mark 1/4 of an inch on the bottom left hand side, and we're going to cut up to the point and from the point up, so we end up with a slant. Okay, and as I said earlier, I'm making a slanted welt pocket. If you're making a straight one, you should leave the sides straight. Okay, so I've cut my fusible interfacing with a slant, taking 1/4 of an inch top, 1/4 of an inch bottom to the points, and we are going to fuse it to our piece of fabric that we're going to use to form the welt, and we'll place it on like so, and we'll fuse that on. You'll notice the actual fabric is bigger than the interfacing, and we're going to use the interfacing as a template to cut our fabric once this has been fused. So I'll fuse that now. So I've fused onto the wrong side of the fabric, which is going to be used for the welt. You'll notice that the sides, okay, these are parallel to the grain of the fabric. Okay, so the grain runs like this. If you fuse it at the angle, then your fabric will be off, and you want to maintain, obviously if you're making something with stripes or plaid, you'll want these to be straight against the grain of the fabric. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure 3/8 of an inch either side, parallel, and along the top I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch. So I'm just going to draw a line on. So using my ruler here, I'm going to mark 3/8 of an inch on the right hand side. Just chalk it in. The same for the left hand side. 3/8 of an inch. And as I said, for the top I'm going to put 5/8 of an inch. Okay, we're going to cut the bottom along the fusible interfacing, and we're going to cut the fabric as we've just marked. So I'll do that. Okay, so here, so here's our welt. Fusible interfacing, obviously, 3/8 of an inch either side, 5/8 along the top, and we're going to be using this along with the pocket linings to make the first part of the welt pocket. So here's one of my lining pieces, and I'm going to take the second piece and place it on top, and we're going to mark 1/2 inch down on one side, draw a line to the corner, and we're going to cut the corner off at a slant. This allows the pocket to sit nicely within the front. So marking down 1/2 inch, and we'll just draw a line up and along. Okay, and we'll trim this piece off. I shall do that now. Okay, so I've cut my pocket pieces at an angle going down 1/2 inch. Okay, and this is going to be the first step in creating our welt pocket. So with one piece of the pocketing, I'm going to take our welt, I'm going to place it, line it up along the top edge of the pocket piece, and we're going to take 1/4 inch seam, and we're going to sew the welt onto the pocket piece. Make sure you back tack at both ends to secure it in place. So I'll take it to the machine and do that. Okay, so I've sewn the welt, okay, to the pocket lining, and I've used 1/4 inch seam. I'm using obviously contrasting thread so you can see, and you will then want to open this out and press this seam open. Okay, so give that a quick press open, which I shall do for you. Alright, so I've taken this seam and I've pressed it open. Okay, going back to how we were with the welt sitting on top of the pocketing, we're going to use this edge as a guide, and we're going to fold or push the welt up, okay, so it lines up with the fusible interfacing, and we're going to press this nice and neat. Okay, so you end up with a step. See there. Okay, top. So I've pressed the welt up using the edge of the fusible as a guide, and if I flip it over, you can see the seam that we've sewn. This is the top of the welt, okay, and we're going to use the edge of the fusible as a guide, and we're going to sew along from the top to the bottom, from the top to the bottom, and that's through all layers, so we're catching the pocketing and the top of the welt. I shall do that now. Okay, so I've sewn along each side of the welt from top to bottom. If I flip it over, you can see how it goes across the seam we made earlier on. Okay, now we're going to have a little trim, and we're going to take our scissors and we're going to cut into the pocketing up to the last stitch that we just made, so straight across, and snip a little triangle. Okay, we'll also cut the top corners close to those stitches and just trim our seam allowances. We don't want a bulky welt pocket. Just move these bits so we can see, and we're going to repeat for the other side. So again, snip your corners off, parallel to the bottom of the welt, snip in right up to that last little bit of stitching, snip our seam allowances down and just make a little triangle in. So there we are with our welt and our pocket lining attached. Okay, so there's the back, there's the front. So there we go for the first step. This is the welt attached to your pocket lining. Okay, and what I'm going to do before I turn the pocket welt, I'm just going to mark up from the bottom. Okay, I'm just going to draw a line onto the interfacing at 3/8 of an inch, and this will become useful later when we go to actually sew the welt onto the front of the garment. Okay, so now I'm just going to turn everything through. So just turn the welt, okay, pop it through, and then taking your point turner or another not too sharp object, okay, just get your corners nice and crisp on your welts, both sides. Okay, and there you can see this will be the outside of the welt when it's on the finished garment, and this will be the inside. So the welt comes over and then suddenly becomes the lining of the pocket. So I'm just going to go and give that a nice press. So here we go with the welt nicely pressed. If you flip it over, you can see the inside, so you can see how the fabric comes over the top, and then we move to our pocket lining. Okay, so that's one of the easier steps. The next step is to start working actually on the front of your jacket or coat, whatever it may be, that's going to have the welt applied to it. So I showed you previously how I'd marked the position of my welt. Now I thread trace this because it's easy to see, and also I want to be able to see the reverse, and I want to see on the inside of this front of my jacket or whatever it may be. If you remember, I said I cut a piece of pocketing which was 2 inches by 6 inches. This is going to be applied to the back of your garment, and it acts as a reinforcement, because after we've sewn the welt on, we're going to have to start actually cutting into this jacket, and this acts as a reinforcement to those cuts. So I'm going to flip my fabric over. Okay, so here's the reverse side, and we're going to place our pocketing over the line that we've marked, and we want to come down about 1/2 inch. So if the line's there, we're about 1/2 inch below it, okay, and keep it pretty parallel, about 1/2 inch. Okay, and then you can either pin it or baste it in place. So I'll quickly pop some pins in. Okay, so there's our reinforcement on the back. So if you now flip our fabric back over, we're going to look at positioning our welt onto the jacket. Now obviously when it's all finished, it's going to end up sitting like this, but we need to sew the welt upside down, and this is where this line that we marked on here, this is where this comes in useful. We're going to line this up with the line on the front of our garment, like so. Okay, obviously the welt's upside down, don't worry, it will all go the right way when we've sewn it and flip it through. So we're going to pin this in place and we're going to sew along this line that we've drawn on our fusible interfacing. The key is trying to keep the pocketing out the way whilst keeping the welt on the line. It's a little bit fiddly, but it doesn't take too long. And once we're pinned, I'm going to go and I'm going to sew along this line that we marked. So I should do that. Okay, so I've sewn the welt onto the front of the garment along the line we drew previously, and it's a bit tricky to see. Okay, make sure you tack it well at both ends, and if I flip it over you can see the stitching line which runs through this reinforcement piece, so I can remove these pins. The next step is to place the top part of the pocketing. So we've got one half of the pocketing in place because that's attached to the welt, which when it gets folded up will form our welt lovely. Okay, we need to now attach the second piece of pocketing to the garment itself. So here's my second piece, and if I just move this you can see here is this slanted line that we cut earlier. Okay, and we're going to place this second pocket piece with the slanted line, okay, and we're going to tuck it underneath the edge of the welt, okay, to the stitching line. Now we're going to attach this second piece of pocketing to the front of our garment, okay, but what's really important is that our stitching lines are going to be slightly shorter than the ones below. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pin this piece of pocketing in place just to hold it whilst we start marking things. Okay, so we're ready to go now, and we're going to stitch following the edge of our welt here. Okay, I've stitched this piece of pocketing, okay, following the line along the top of the welt. Okay, I haven't actually stitched the welt is still free, but I use that as a guide. But I started probably an 1/8 of an inch in from this stitching that we did to attach the welt, and I finished about the same. And if I flip it over you can see, so this stitching line is the original where we attached the welt, and the top stitching line, okay, is where we've just attached the second piece of pocketing. So I'm going to remove the pins, you don't need those anymore, and I think we're going to do the bit which most people are scared, you know, it's quite a scary thought. You've got something lovely and you're going to cut it, and what we're going to do is we're going to cut between the lines that we've just sewn, okay, but we need to stop short. So if I flip it over so we can see, we're going to slash through reinforcement in the back and the fabric, okay, but we're going to stop short because we're going to cut a triangle to each of those ends of those stitching lines. Now it's up to you how far you go, but I would leave yourself plenty of space. And what's really important is you clip as close as you can to those stitch lines, or to the ends of the stitching, okay. You want to go right up to those stitches. If you go over them or go through them, you'll end up with holes on the other side. If you come up short, you'll end up with corners that are all puckered when you fold your welt up. And it's just really important you take your time and you cut very, very carefully. Okay, so I'm going to go and I'm going to cut. So from the back, I've slashed, okay, through. Now what you've got to be really careful is you don't cut any of the pocketing, you don't cut the welt, you are literally cutting through your fabric and that reinforcement. Okay, so you can see I've snipped right up to the ends to form a little triangle here, okay, both ends, but I've only cut through. You can still see there's the welt underneath. Okay, I haven't cut that, I've literally cut through just those 2 layers of fabric. And this is where the magic begins. Okay, so the front, here is our welt sewn in, and here's our second piece of pocketing, and we can start putting things together. And what we're going to do is we're going to poke pocketing into the hole you just cut. There we go. And we're going to do the same with the welt. We're going to poke the whole lot through. It's a bit tricky to do. I'm going to turn it over. Okay, and we should have one welt coming through. Okay, and our second piece of pocketing. When we look back on the other side, we can see we've got something now that's starting to look like a welt pocket. Okay, really hard to see it. It's just a case now of tidying up, making sure that the corners of your welt sit nicely and flush. Okay, and give everything a really good press. You want to make sure that the welt pocket itself, as you can see, look, comes through, and this is where you can tell if you haven't cut quite to the ends. Okay, if you've not quite cut, it's going to bunch in the corners, so just, you can clip away a little bit of seam allowance that's not going to show if you get that problem, or trim to that line. So make sure everything pulls through nicely. Then on the front you'll have a nice welt pocket. So like I say, go and give it all a good press and then we'll finish it off. So I've given my welt a nice press. I'll just remove these marking stitches. Okay, and you can see here we have a nicely set welt. Obviously it's not attached. There's a couple of ways of attaching the welt. You can very carefully slip stitch just along this edge so it's invisible. Occasionally you might see a bar tack going across the top. Choice is yours really. The idea is you don't want to see any stitching either end. And on the back you've got our 2 pieces of pocketing now. Okay, and all you need to do is sew around. Okay, go right to the top there, and that will finish off your pocket bag lovely. So I'll just sew up the pocket bag, and then I'll pop a couple of stitches along here to conceal the and hold the welt down, and that'll be that. So I've finished everything off. I've sewn the pocket bag on the back, just sewn it round and just trimmed it off. So I'll trim all these loose threads. Okay, that's the back done, and then on the front there we have your welt pocket, and I've sewn down the sides. Okay, you can just see there's nothing showing, and of course when you open it up you have a real pocket that works. So there we go, how to sew a Welt pocket. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and hopefully in the future when you see an item of clothing that has a Welt pocket you won't be so scared. Thanks for watching, and please do follow me.